Hey everybody, it's Brian here, coach and nutritionist at Triage Method, and today I'm going to be talking to you about what sorts of foods should you be eating from the standpoint of fat in the diet. Okay, which foods are the healthiest in terms of dietary fat sources? That's what we're going to dig into, so let's get going. There are 3 to 4 types of dietary fat that you'll find in the food supply, okay? So I want to make the point that I'll be discussing foods that contain different types of fats. However, we have to keep in mind that all foods contain a blend of the different types of fats that we can find in the diet. So when I say that, for example, butter is high in saturated fat, it doesn't mean that it's exclusively saturated fat in butter, but it is in there in the largest ratio. The main types of fats that we're going to be dealing with are going to be saturated fat, which has no carbon double bonds. That gives it the name. There's monounsaturated fats, which have 1 double carbon bond in their structure, which is why they're called mono being 1.
Mono means 1, and rail means rail.
And then there's polyunsaturated fats, which have many double carbon bonds in their structure. So that's how the terminology comes about. Not really that important, but we're going to get into it, and I want to use those as terms to help identify the different fats in the diet, because when we're looking at fats from a health perspective, the different types do matter, and it's better to eat some rather than others, and it's better to eat more of some rather than more of others, I should say, because they do all have roles to play. People might talk about saturated fat and how you want to limit your intake of saturated fat, and while that may be true, and I will go into that in some more detail very shortly, we do also have to acknowledge that saturated fat does have a role to play in health and in the body. So it's not that you would just reduce it to 0, but it's about the ratios and the proportions of these different foods that are in your diet and that make up your whole dietary pattern. There is one more type of fatty acid that I did not mention, which is trans fats. And the reason I didn't mention them is that because they are very unequivocally detrimental to health overall, you don't actually find them in the food supply that much. Now, these are specifically artificially produced trans fats, because you can get trans fats that are naturally occurring in, say, dairy products. It's not the same thing. So we're talking about the man-made trans fats are harmful to health. Therefore, you don't really see them in the food supply, at least not in the European Union for sure. You may get them in other parts of the world, but it's not something that you need to necessarily check for on food labels if you're living in Europe. Even in the likes of the United States, it's also sort of being pulled out of the food supply because it is harmful, and there's no reason to have it in the food supply when it's very conclusively the case that it's not a good idea for people to be eating it. So good public health measure is to take it out of there so people can't consume it. So from a health point of view, the polyunsaturated fats, so the PUFAs as they're also known, tend to be the healthiest overall. If you look at broad nutrition research and you look at health outcomes, you'll see that higher intakes of polyunsaturated fats are associated with better health overall. This can be in the context of cardiovascular health and reduced cardiovascular disease. This can be in the context of managing inflammation in the body. So they have a lot of benefits, and they're one thing to focus on in terms of selecting foods based on their fat sources. And sources of PUFAs will be things like nuts, seeds, that includes seed oil such as rapeseed oil. Chicken has some PUFAs in there, egg yolk has some PUFAs in there, and then oily fish as well is a fantastic source of PUFAs, and you specifically get these marine-derived omega-3s, which are probably the most important fats for health overall. So it's really, really crucial that when you're looking at your diet from a fat intake perspective, that you are somehow ticking that box that, okay, I am going to consume some marine-derived omega-3s, whether that's from the oily fish themselves, oily fish being things like salmon, mackerel, herrings, sardines, anchovies. They're all oily fish. They're all fatty fish. They have the highest quantity of omega-3s. So if you're eating fish, definitely include those. And if you're not, then you may have to look at a good quality fish oil omega-3 supplement that will provide those marine-derived omega-3s. Specifically, they're referred to as EPA and DHA. And this is important to know because you can have discussions about omega-3 fats being found in things like seeds and nuts and even beef, for example, but it's not the same omega-3s. It's not the EPA and DHA, and we can only really get them from those marine-derived sources. So very, very important to tick that box when it comes to nutrition, and that's a really important part of this whole fat discussion. Next, we move on to the MUFAs, or the monounsaturated fats, which are also quite healthy. In terms of nutrition research, they do have health benefits. They are found in a lot of healthful foods. Specifically, we're looking at the more plant-derived MUFAs because, as I keep saying, right, there's the different fats. There's the MUFAs, the PUFAs, and the saturated fat. You find them basically throughout the food supply where a food is a legitimate source of fat in most cases. It seems that in the case of the MUFAs, it's the plant-derived MUFAs that are more beneficial rather than the animal-derived ones. But I'm going to go through the different foods now where you can find these monounsaturated fatty acids. So we've got things like olives and olive oil, of course. We've got things like avocados. We've got things like nuts. We've got things like seeds. These are all really good sources of MUFAs. And also we can consider dark chocolate and cacao products in this conversation as well. They're rich in MUFAs. And we can think about also some of the animal-derived MUFAs, such as meats. So things like red meat, for example, things like pork tend to be higher in MUFAs compared to some other meats. Chicken will have a certain amount. Now, chicken is lean depending on how you consume it. So I'm referring to the higher fat options when it comes to chicken when I'm talking about the fat content, because obviously if you're eating lean chicken breast and it's like 1 gram of fat per 100 grams or whatever, then that's not providing a significant amount of fatty acids. But if you're eating, say, chicken thighs, which are a bit higher in fat, or chicken with the skin on, the majority, well, actually in the case of chicken, the fat breakdown is actually quite even. It's almost an even split amongst the MUFAs, PUFAs, and saturated fats. Now we're going to talk about the saturated fats in the food supplies. So when we're talking about saturated fats, these are the ones that are considered to be more unhealthy, let's say, but I don't want to just leave that out there as like a broad statement because it depends on the dietary context. Like you could be eating saturated fats and it could be within the recommended less than 10% of your total daily calories. And in that case, there's absolutely no problem. And then we can also consider what the rest of your lifestyle and diet looks like. So I'm not just going to say blanket statement, you shouldn't eat saturated fat. That would not be accurate. That would not be fair to say. But we do know that when people over-consume saturated fat, that it increases their risk of heart disease through saturated fat's mechanism of action on LDL cholesterol, which when that goes up, it increases your risk of heart disease. So we know that, therefore, one of the bigger interventions for something like for lowering LDL cholesterol is to look at a saturated fat intake in the diet and see, can we replace that saturated fat with more monounsaturated or more polyunsaturated fats? And this tends to move the needle from a health point of view for people in terms of managing their cholesterol. So the food sources of saturated fat are going to be things like dairy products. So this extends to cheese, yogurt, milk, cream, and butter, where they are high fat options in terms of things like yogurt, because of course you can get zero fat yogurt, so that wouldn't be relevant to this discussion. But the fattier versions of those foods, I mean, even within this, we have to have a sort of a nuanced discussion, because it doesn't seem that the likes of the less refined, let's say, fats within the dairy category, so I'm talking about things like cheese, I'm talking about things like yogurt, I'm talking about things like milk, they don't seem to have a negative impact necessarily on overall cardiovascular health. Whereas when we look at the more refined options that are more pure fat, let's say, that's basically what we mean here, is that something like butter is basically just fat. It doesn't have a lot of other nutrition in it. Whereas things like cheese and yogurt, they've got micronutrients, they've got protein. That seems to make a difference here. So the actual food matrix is important to consider, and it's more like the butter and the cream that tend to drive up LDL cholesterol, it seems, compared to those other dairy fat options. Now, we're also going to get saturated fats from meat. So red meat specifically, it can be quite high in saturated fat, and that's quite easy to work around, because if you just choose for leaner sources of red meat, then you cut down your intake of saturated fat immediately compared to what it could be. So if you're choosing, say, beef mince that's 20% fat, you're going to consume a lot more saturated fat that way versus 95% lean option that is only 5% fat. Chicken, as I mentioned already, has some amount of saturated fat in it, and so do egg yolks. And then we've got the plant-based saturated fats as well, things like coconut oil and palm oil, which can be found in the food supply. And again, they're treated as a saturated fat. They should be limited potentially where they can have a negative impact on the blood lipid profile. Of course, like I said, this is in the context of the whole diet pattern. If you're eating around 10% of your calories or thereabouts from saturated fat, then you're probably in a good place. If you have a higher risk of heart disease for potentially genetic reasons, other lifestyle reasons, other disease conditions, anything like that, then you may benefit from pushing that lower. But overall, I'm talking to the vast majority of people here. If they can do that with their diet, if they can essentially, to sum this up, if they can essentially choose more of the plant-based, unsaturated fats, i.e. the MUFAs and the PUFAs, and make those the basis of their diet. So if I'm talking about saturated fat being in around 10% or less, then that means you're trying to make up the other 90% of your diet from these unsaturated fat sources. Predominantly, they will be plant-based, but we do also want you to make sure to get some sort of marine omega-3s, and that is basically going to cover it. So it's not that complicated, but now you know what to do, and I hope this helps. And if you want to see more nutrition content, please make sure to subscribe, follow us, and stay up to date with what we're doing, because we're putting out lots of video content on all different topics related to health, nutrition, and fitness.